The first time the warning was delivered, it did not come with threats, raised voices, or dramatic gestures, which were precisely why the Galactic Council failed to take it seriously, because the council chambers were used to bombast, to florid speeches by species who mistook volume for authority, and the human delegate did neither, standing at the center ring with hands folded behind his back, posture relaxed in a way many of the watching delegates misread as submissive rather than controlled. His name registered in the chamber systems as Elias Ward, Terran Union Diplomatic Corps, age 46. Background notes quietly accessible to any who care to check, showing careers spent de-escalating frontier conflicts and negotiating trade corridors rather than commanding fleets. And that too fed the assumption that he was not someone who brought bad news worth fearing, as Ward spoke calmly about the outer spiral instability, about the disappearance of unmapped stars along old trade routes, about sensor ghosts and the sudden failure of long-range beacons, and when murmurs rippled through the chamber, he raised one hand gently and said that humanity had been monitoring the pattern for decades and had come to a conclusion the Council would not like, that the pattern was artificial, deliberate, and accelerating, and that whatever force was responsible did not expand the way known empires did, but erase infrastructure and stellar output entirely, not conquering but extinguishing, and that humanity had evidence it was responding to perceived threats, to attention, to attempts at contact, and that the Council should suspend expansion fleets beyond the Perseus reach and shut down high-energy signaling for a period of observation. And it was at this point that several delegates laughed openly, including High Arbiter Kethrix of the Vaughn Collective, whose species had ruled 3,000 systems through relentless outward pressure and could not conceive of a danger that punished expansion itself, and Kethrix replied that the Council did not govern by superstition or human paranoia, and that stars vanish for many reasons across cosmic time, and Ward did not argue. He merely said that humanity had already lost 7 listening posts and 2 uninhabited systems to the phenomenon, and that they had stopped transmitting in affected regions, which had slowed but not halted the losses. And he ended by saying that if the Council ignored the warning, humanity would act independently to protect its borders and allies, and he hoped that would not be misinterpreted as hostility. And then he stepped back, bowed slightly in a way that was old even by human standards, and left the speaking circle, and the Council moved on to trade disputes and border tariffs, because that was what it always did when faced with information that did not fit its existing models. And within a standard week, the minutes recorded Ward's statement as an informational anomaly with low confidence weighting. And within a standard month, the Council authorized 3 new expansion initiatives beyond the Perseus reach led by the Thal Dominion and the Vaughn Collective jointly, fleets burning bright with jump signatures and long-range beacon proclaiming their presence to any who might challenge their claim. And it was then that the stars began to go dark in a way that could not be dismissed, because it was not the slow dimming of a dying sun or the violent flare of a supernova, but a sudden clean absence. Systems that simply ceased to exist as gravitational wells, their mass converted or removed in a manner that left navigational voids and shattered jump corridors. And at first the Council blamed experimental weapons or unknown empires, until sensor logs showed something was, that the disappearance followed activation events, that every time a fleet entered a new system with full power and announced itself, that system star vanished within hours or days, and panic spread unevenly, some species retreating while others doubled down, convinced that fear was a real enemy, and through all of it humanity went quiet in Council space, closing embassies, recalling delegates, and shutting down public networks, while within human territory something else happened entirely, because the warning Ward delivered had not been a guess but a conclusion drawn from a classified archive known only to a handful of human institutions, records left behind by a prior cycle of civilization that humanity had uncovered on a dead world centuries earlier, a civilization that had mapped not empires but predators, and had catalogued a cosmic defense mechanism triggered by technological saturation, a self-correcting extinction engine that scoured regions of space when energy thresholds were crossed too aggressively, and humanity had learned to live beneath that threshold, to build compact, efficient, dark technology that did not scream into the void. And now as Council, fleets burn like flares in the night, drawing the extinction engine closer. Human strategists watched star maps with grim confirmation as ancient predictions came true, and in a quiet command center beneath the Andes, Admiral Rhea Alvarez stood over a projection of the Perseus reach as another star winked out, turned to her staff, and said softly that the Council had ignored the warning exactly as expected, and that Phase 1 containment protocols were now active, meaning humanity would know. longer tried to save the galaxy from itself, but would instead prepare to survive what came next, because the engine did not stop once awakened. It only expanded until no stimuli remained, and if the Council did not learn quickly, there would be no stars left close enough to teach them, and somewhere far from the Council chambers where laughter had once echoed, a human listening array recorded a change in the background radiation that marked the extinction engine's attention shifting inward, toward the densely populated core worlds, and the stars that began, one by one, to fade. As the second wave of stars vanished closer to the core, panic finally reached a level the Galactic Council could no longer insulate itself from, because this time the losses were not frontier systems or aggressive expansion routes, but established worlds with billions of lives. And the first confirmed extinction of a core system happened during a live council session when a junior analyst burst through protocol to announce that the Iridal Prime star had collapsed into nothingness without precursor radiation, taking with it a trade nexus older than most council species, and the chamber erupted into chaos as delegates shouted accusations and demands, some calling it an attack, others insisting on retaliation against imagined enemies, while High Arbiter Kethrix demanded immediate mobilization of every remaining Vaughn fleet, and it was only then that the absence of humanity was noted, their embassy dark, their delegates gone, their data feed silent, which sparked a new suspicion. That humans were involved, because in times of fear the Quiet One always became the suspect, and an emergency vote authorized forced entry into the abandoned human embassy where Council security found nothing dramatic, no weapons, no hidden transmitters, just stripped terminals and a single data crystal left deliberately on the central table containing a copy of Elias Ward's original warning, time-stamped and authenticated, along with a final note stating that further activation events would accelerate losses exponentially, and even then the Council hesitated, because accepting the warning meant admitting centuries of expansion doctrine had been wrong, and so instead they compromised in the most Council-like way possible by reducing beacon power by a fraction while still authorizing defensive fleet movements, which accomplished nothing except slowing the rate of extinction just enough to create false hope, while Inhuman Space Admiral Alvarez oversaw the transition to Phase 2, which involved collapsing outward trade routes, rerouting civilian populations into shielded habitats, and activating infrastructure that most humans did not even know existed, vast hollowed asteroids lined with low-emission cities, fleets designed not for visible power but for stealth, heat sinks bleeding energy into dimensions mapped only by human physics. And the reason humanity could do this was cultural as much as technological, because for centuries they had feared not invasion but attention, their myths filled with warnings about shouting into the dark, their science shaped by efficiency over spectacle, and now those instincts proved correct, as human space remained untouched while Council worlds burned themselves out simply by existing too loudly, and the extinction engine drew closer to the core, not malicious, not intelligent in any relatable sense, but responsive like a cosmic immune system triggered by excess. And when the Thal Dominion finally lost its capital star, mid-transmission, their grand fleet frozen in panic as navigation failed and their sun vanished, the surviving Thal leaders sent a desperate, humiliating request for aid not to the Council but directly to humanity, because by then it was clear who had been spared, and the message reached Elias Ward, now reassigned as liaison to extinction survival operations, who listened in silence before replying that humanity could not stop the engine, only avoid it, and that survival required drastic changes the Council had long refused, including abandoning high-energy travel, dismantling megastructures, and accepting human guidance, and the Thal hesitated for only seconds before agreeing, because fear had finally burned away pride, and as human stealth fleets moved in to evacuate what populations they could using methods that barely registered on sensors, a truth settled across the galaxy that was more terrifying than the loss of stars, that humanity had known this was coming, had prepared quietly, and had tried once to warn everyone, and now the stars were going dark not because humans had attacked, but because the galaxy had refused to listen. By the time the third phase unfolded, the idea of a unified galactic council had effectively ceased to exist, replaced by fragmented emergency blocks and survival coalitions that formed and dissolved in days as stars continued to vanish in a tightening spiral toward the most energy-dense regions, and the realization spread that the extinction engine was not hunting species but gradients, drawn inexorably toward power concentrations like water flowing downhill, which meant the most advanced, proud, and brightly burning civilizations were being erased first, and this inverted the galactic hierarchy almost overnight, leaving quieter, less developed worlds suddenly isolated but alive, while former empires became ghost records and archival databases. And into this chaos humanity stepped not as conqueror but as a grim instructor. Because every rescue they offered came with conditions that many found humiliating but none could deny were effective, including the dismantling of fusion arrays, the shutdown of planetary shields that screamed into subspace, and the adoption of human-designed low-emission habitats that felt regressive to species who had equated progress with scale. And Elias Ward became the public face of these terms, appearing via narrow-beam communications that barely registered as noise, his tone unchanged from the day he had first delivered the warning, calm, factual, and unyielding, explaining again and again that the extinction engine could not be bargained with or destroyed because it was not a weapon but a process embedded into the structure of the galaxy long before any current civilization arose, likely by a species that had faced a universe choked by unchecked expansion and had chosen annihilation over stagnation. And as Ward spoke, scientists across remaining world compared human data with their own and reached the same horrifying conclusion, that humanity had not only discovered the engine centuries ago, but had reverse-engineered its thresholds, building an entire civilization beneath the cosmic noise floor. And this sparked a mixture of awe and resentment, because it meant humans had lived for generations with the knowledge that the galaxy was sitting on a trigger, and yet it continued to trade, negotiate, and smile politely while others rushed toward oblivion, and some accused humanity of moral failure for not forcing the truth sooner. To which Admiral Alvarez responded bluntly in a rare broadcast that humanity had tried exactly once through lawful channels and had been dismissed, and that humans did not believe in saving civilizations against their will, especially when those civilizations mocked caution as weakness, and this honesty cut deeper than any weapon, because it reframed the narrative from betrayal to consequence. And as more species accepted human oversight, human enclaves appeared like shadows across space, escorting refugee fleets through darkened corridors, teaching engineers how to bleed, excess energy into inert mass, rewriting physics textbooks across cultures that had assumed brightness equaled dominance, and the extinction engine slowed perceptibly in regions where these practices took hold, not stopping but flowing past like a tide diverted by terrain. And for the first time a fragile hope emerged that survival was possible not through victory but through humility, though that hope was tempered by the knowledge that entire cultures had already been lost, including the Vaughn Collective, whose last transmission was a furious denunciation of humanity moments before their core star vanished, and Ward archived it without comment, because blame no longer mattered, only adaptation did. And as the galactic map stabilized into zones of darkness and survival, one truth became undeniable even to humanity's critics, that the most dangerous thing in the universe was not a hostile species or superweapon, but unchecked certainty, and humanity's greatest strength had never been its fleets or technology, but its ancient instinct to survive by staying quiet, watching carefully, and knowing when not to reach for stars. The fourth stage of the crisis unfolded not with another cascade of stellar extinctions, but with something far more destabilizing, the moment when the extinction engine changed behavior in a way humanity had predicted but hoped never to witness, because as more civilizations dimmed themselves under human guidance, reducing emissions and collapsing megastructures, the overall gradient that had drawn the engine inward weakened, and instead of advancing smoothly, it began to fragment its influence, producing pockets of localized erasure that appeared without warning inside regions previously considered safe, which shattered the fragile confidence of the survival coalitions and reignited fear that adaptation alone might not be enough. And in response, some species panicked and attempted to flee en masse using forbidden high-energy jumps, instantly lighting themselves up like torches and triggering catastrophic losses that erased entire refugee fleets mid-transit, reinforcing the brutal lesson that there would be no second chances. And it was during this period that humanity made its most controversial decision, one that would redefine its place in galactic history, because Admiral Alvarez authorized Phase 3 not as a defensive measure but as an intervention, deploying human technology that had never been revealed even to allies. A network of mass redistribution constructs seated quietly across dead systems, designed not to destroy or block the extinction engine but to feed it harmlessly, siphoning excess cosmic energy into artificial sinks that mimic the signature of extinction events without sacrificing living stars, essentially distracting a force older than civilization with controlled noise. And this worked only partially and temporarily, buying time measured in decades rather than halting the process. But decades were enough to change everything, because it allowed coordinated evacuations, cultural archiving, and the deliberate downscaling of entire societies rather than their annihilation, and when fragments of this operation inevitably leaked to non-human survivors, outrage followed, accusations that humanity had been hoarding salvation, playing God while others burned, and Elias Ward addressed this in what will become the most replayed speech in post-council history, stating plainly that the technology was incomplete, dangerous, and incapable of saving everyone, and that humanity had waited until the cost of revealing it was outweighed by the certainty of extinction, and that those who demanded why humans had not used it earlier were asking the wrong question, because the real question was why so many civilizations had built themselves to require salvation rather than resilience. And this statement marked a turning point, because for the first time the galaxy began to understand humanity not as secretive manipulators, but as a species shaped by deep time fear, by extinction events on their own world that had taught them survival favored adaptability over dominance. And as years passed and the extinction engine's advance slowed into a grim equilibrium, humanity's role shifted again from guide to archivist, preserving languages, art, and histories of civilizations that would not survive the long dimming, while helping others transition into quieter forms of existence that would endure, and in the silence left behind by vanished stars, a new galactic ethic began to take root, one that no longer measured success by expansion or brightness, but by longevity and restraint. And though the universe had grown darker, it was not empty, because in the shadows between extinguished suns, life persisted, guided by a species that had once been ignored when it whispered a warning, and would never again be dismissed when it chose to speak. The fifth movement of the long catastrophe arrived quietly, marked not by sudden loss, but by the slow psychological reckoning that followed survival, because once the immediate terror faded and the extinction engine's presence became a grim constant rather than an accelerating doom, the remaining civilizations were forced to confront what they had become: scattered, dimmed, dependent, and guided by humans whose authority no council vote had ever granted, and this produced friction that no amount of shared trauma could fully erase, as younger species adapted more easily to the new low-emission reality while older empires struggled with a sense of humiliation that festered into resentment, and in several regions this resentment boiled over into rebellion, not against the extinction engine, which no one was foolish enough to challenge anymore, but against human oversight itself, with splinter factions deliberately reigniting dormant reactors or activating ancient relic weapons in defiance, claiming that extinction with dignity was preferable to survival under quiet rules, and every such act ended the same way: a brief flare of power followed by localized erasure that left behind nothing but gravitational scars, and humanity did not intervene to stop these acts beyond issuing warnings, because one of the hardest lessons they had learned on their own world was that some choices could not be prevented without becoming something worse than the danger itself. And Elias Ward documented each loss with the same calm precision he had always used, recording not just the physics but the motivations, because he believed future humans needed to understand that extinction was rarely caused by ignorance alone but by pride. And as decades passed, a new generation of non-human leaders emerged who had never known the old council or the era of expansion, for whom human methods were not humiliating compromises but simply the way reality worked, and with them came genuine collaboration rather than enforced compliance, joint research projects that explored how life could flourish under extreme efficiency, how culture could thrive without spectacle, and how meaning could be preserved when the stars themselves were no longer reliable symbols of eternity. And it was during one such project that human scientists and alien theorists confirmed a hypothesis humanity had long suspected but never proven: that the extinction engine was finite, not in reach but in capacity, designed to reset regions of the galaxy over incomprehensible timescales and then go dormant, implying that survival was not just about hiding forever but about enduring long enough to emerge into a quieter, emptier cosmos. And this knowledge reshaped long-term planning from mere survival to stewardship, prompting humanity to begin preparing seed archives not just of life but of restraint itself, teaching future civilizations how not to repeat the mistakes of their predecessors. And as Admiral Alvarez aged and eventually stepped down, she summarized humanity's role in a single private briefing that would later be declassified, stating that humans had not saved the galaxy and had never claimed to, but they had proven that strength was not measured by how brightly a species burned, but by how long it could exist without demanding the universe notice it. And in that realization, forged through loss and silence, humanity finally understood why the ancient civilization that built the extinction engine had made its terrible choice, and why, If the galaxy was to have a future at all, it would belong not to the loudest voices, but to those willing to live softly among the darkened stars. The sixth phase began when the galaxy finally had time to breathe, and that breathing revealed wounds that silence alone could not heal, because while the extinction engine's activity had slowed into long, predictable cycles, the damage it left behind had reshaped politics, identity, and trust in ways that no technical solution could fix, and the question that emerged was no longer how to survive, but who had the right to decide what survival looked like, as surviving coalitions pushed back against humanity's quiet leadership, not with open defiance but with negotiation, demanding representation, shared authority, and transparency over the technologies that still sat largely in human hands, and this forced humanity into an unfamiliar position, because they had never intended to rule, only to endure, yet now found themselves accused of becoming exactly what the old galactic powers once were, arbiters of acceptable behavior backed not by fleets but by physics itself. And Elias Ward, older now, lines etched deep by years of measured restraint, acknowledged the criticism openly in a summit held not in a grand hall but in a deliberately modest habitat orbiting a dead star, where he stated that humanity had no interest in replacing the Council and would begin transferring knowledge and decision-making power to a new interspecies compact built on shared limits rather than shared ambition, and this compact, later known simply as a covenant of quiet, established principles that would have been unthinkable in the old era: caps on energy usage, mandatory ecological accounting at stellar scales, and the radical idea that expansion required justification rather than assumption. And while many species embraced this as liberation from cycles of hubris, others viewed it as cultural suffocation, arguing that a universe survived by fear was not worth inheriting. And these debates became the new battlegrounds, fought with philosophy instead of weapons, yet no less intense. And humanity participated fully, sometimes losing arguments, sometimes conceding authority, because they understood something the old council never had, that legitimacy came from consent, not survival alone. And during this period, discovery emerged that complicated everything, as deep-range human senses detected a distant region where the extinction engine's influence had completely faded, a vast expanse of dark, quiet space untouched for millions of years, suggesting that resets left behind fertile silence rather than permanent death. And this reignited a dangerous spark of hope among younger civilizations who began to ask whether restraint was truly necessary forever, or merely until the universe reset enough to allow another bright age. And humanity responded with uncharacteristic firmness, releasing the full archive of the ancient builder's record at last, revealing that each reset reduced the galaxy's tolerance further, that every cycle narrowed the margin for error, and that unchecked rebirth would only hasten a final, irreversible silence. And the sobering truth cooled reckless optimism, replacing it with deeper understanding that survival was now a custodial duty stretching across epochs. And as Ward prepared to retire from public life, he recorded a final message intended for humans and non-humans alike, stating that the greatest mistake the old galaxy had made was believing the universe existed to be filled, when in truth it existed to be inhabited carefully. And that lesson, he said, was a real warning humanity had tried to give long before the stars began to go dark. The final chapter did not arrive with a final extinction or a triumphant rebirth, but with something far rarer in galactic history: acceptance, because after centuries of adjustment, debate, and quiet endurance, the remaining civilization settled into a rhythm that no longer revolved around fear of the extinction engine but around respect for its existence, treating it not as an enemy but as a boundary condition of reality itself. And under the covenant of quiet, the galaxy became smaller yet deeper, cultures folding inward rather than outward, refining art, science, and philosophy within limits that once would have been considered suffocating but now felt protective. And humanity slowly receded from the center of events, not by force or decree but because their role had been fulfilled, their knowledge shared, their authority diluted into collective stewardship. And Elias Ward's death passed with little ceremony beyond a simple archival marker noting that the man who had first spoken the warning had lived long enough to see it understood. And in the long epochs that followed, the extinction engine completed its cycle and faded as predicted, not gone but dormant, a cosmic scar rather than an active wound. And when the first cautious expansions resumed, they were nothing like the old empires, no blazing fleets or declaration beacons, just careful probes and low-energy habitats seeded like moss rather than fire. And humanity participated as equals rather than leaders, sometimes advising, sometimes learning, because a galaxy that emerged no longer measured greatness by dominance, and in distant future records compiled by species who had never known the old council, humanity was remembered not as conquerors or saviors, but as the ones who had listened to the universe when it whispered no, and had the courage to stop reaching when stopping was a harder choice. And the final irony, recorded in a quiet human archive beneath a mountain that no longer existed, was that the ancient civilization that built the extinction engine had feared eternal stagnation more than annihilation, while humanity and its allies had proven that meaning did not require infinite growth, only continuity. And so the stars did not return in their former abundance, but those that remained burned steadily, witnessed by civilizations that finally understood that survival was not about shining the brightest, but about lasting long enough to be seen at all.